Our guest today is the President of the Illinois Senate. He was elected to the Illinois General Assembly in 1979 and served in the Illinois House for 12 years. In 1992, he was elected to the Illinois Senate. He was elected President of the Illinois Senate in January 2009. Our guest today is a graduate of Loyola University and Loyola University Law School. He lives in Chicago with his wife, Pam. The smartest decision he ever made was to marry Pam. Pam, welcome, and thank you for being with us today. They are the parents of 5 beautiful children. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the City Club of Chicago, the President of the Illinois Senate, John Cullerton. Mr. President. All right, John, have some fun. There's your note.
Thank you very much, Jay. I want to thank the City Club for, again, affording me the opportunity to address you today as we recognize Casimir Pulaski Day throughout our great state. These get-togethers are important because it allows me to explain, if not dispel, what we have and haven't done in Springfield without either of us having to adjust for a media filter. You have been introduced to, I'm the President of the Senate, the Speaker of my House, Pam Cullerton. I'd also like to introduce my press secretary who is here, Rakisha Falan. Rakisha is over here. And I want to thank all my fellow senators for showing up today. I'll see you tomorrow in Springfield. Here's what I want to talk about today. Our accomplishments the last couple of years, taxes, our budget, and some more reforms that we have to pass this year. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions. 2 years ago, I stood before you as a freshly minted Senate President in the midst of one of the darkest chapters of Illinois history. We are not proud of the circumstances, but we are proud of our conduct. Looking back, I believe there is near uniform agreement that the Illinois Senate handled the impeachment trial of Governor Blagojevich in a fair and professional manner that ultimately cleansed us of a corrupt politician but signaled a deeper change in the Senate. The session we recently concluded has been described by one as the most productive in Illinois history. Unfortunately, many of the accomplishments have escaped the media's attention, so I want to just review them for you. Ethics. Here's a list of things we allegedly didn't pass that somehow became the law. We overhauled the State's Freedom of Information Act, providing the public and the media improved and faster access to its government while giving new, meaningful powers to the Attorney General's office to force disclosure when necessary, and it's proven effective. Open government. Just recently, we overhauled the Senate rules regarding the governor's appointments. For the first time ever, you can go to the state website and track those appointments the same as any other proposal pending in the Senate. No longer do reporters on the public have to call Senate staff or track down paperwork at the Capitol. Salary information and the appointments term are just a click away. And the House and the Senate have sent the governor Senate Bill 1 to end the practice of holdover appointees who, after their terms have ended, managed to cling to state posts for years without ever going before the Senate for a public review and a vote of confidence. I encourage the governor to sign that legislation to complete the modernization of the appointment process and reinforce the system the Constitution created. And I'd be remiss if I didn't remind everyone of the work that the 95th General Assembly did to get the initial pay-to-play ban enacted. That legislation banned state officials from receiving contributions from entities receiving state contracts. It is arguably the most effective ethics legislation ever passed. It is why Rod Blagojevich was arrested. The law was advanced in response to the former governor's aggressive fundraising. He vetoed it. The General Assembly overrode the veto. The governor responded by kicking his fundraising into an even higher gear in an effort to get as much cash as possible before the law took effect on January 1st, 2009. And it was in response to that fundraising activity that federal authorities wiretapped his phones. The rest is history. I only wish every law could be so effective. Campaign finance. We passed the first ever limits on campaign giving in Illinois' history. The limits are imposed on individuals, corporations, political committees, labor unions, political parties, legislative leader committees, and special interest. Campaign reports are now due 4 times a year instead of twice, and the State Elections Board is empowered to conduct random audits of the filings. In light of the Citizens United ruling, where 501c4 organizations are free to spend as much as they like on campaigns, and they are essentially answerable to no one, we may need to tighten our rules even further. Our capital bill. With bipartisan agreement, we finally brushed aside 10 years of political dysfunction and improved in 10 weeks the tax and fee increases needed to finance a $31 billion construction program to maintain and modernize the state's roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, and other infrastructure. We passed the largest stimulus bill of any state in the nation, and state transportation officials declared 2010 to be the busiest construction season in Illinois history. The program invested $2.7 billion, for example, in the CTA, and will finance several major road projects. So all of those road projects throughout the state came from our capital bill, not from your alderman. The passage of this capital bill puts thousands to work. The legislation behind this program has met with some legal challenges, but given the bipartisan support in 2009, I'm quite confident it can be reenacted if necessary. Pension reform. Proving the media pundits wrong, the Democrat-controlled House and Senate approved sweeping changes to public pension systems, creating a new tier of retirement benefits for those hired after January 1st of this year. Retirement age is raised to 67. We end double dipping and significantly scale back legislators' and judges' pensions going forward. Perhaps the most important aspect of this reform is that it's constitutional. It is in place, and over the next 3 decades, will save taxpayers $72 billion in reduced contributions and reduce future liabilities in the pension system by more than $250 billion. McCormick Place. In response to business concerns, we overhauled the union work rules at McCormick Place, cutting bureaucratic red tape and lowering costs for conventions. The results have been immediate. Conventions are returning and re-upping, bringing an estimated $1 billion in consumer investment to Illinois. Those last 2 accomplishments, pensions and McCormick Place, were opposed by our traditional allies in the labor unions, but we recognize the need for changes, and they are now the law. Medicaid reform, another area of reform. We worked with Republicans to change the Medicaid program. We added increased scrutiny of enrollees who must now prove residency and verify their income with a month's worth of information. No longer will there be an automatic rollover. Enrollees must prove annually that they remain eligible. The All Kids program of Governor Blagojevich has been scaled back, so maybe we'll have to call it the Most Kids program. By 2015, half of our Medicaid enrollees must be in managed care programs. Only a tiny portion currently are. The new law also allows the state to reclaim payments and impose fines on those caught gaming the system. So whether you, by the way, agree or not with the next 2 items, establishing civil unions and abolishing Illinois' death penalty, they are, in my view, an important measure of our state's conscience. So finally, we then addressed our $15 billion deficit. So you cannot say we were a do-nothing General Assembly. Now, I'm sure you've heard plenty about our deficit and our solution in the news. It was with no great joy that the General Assembly recently voted to raise taxes. Let's be clear on that. The House and the Senate were compelled to act because of our fiscal health had been ignored for too long. Some considered Illinois government the biggest drag on the state's economy, citing the inability to pay bills and unwillingness to address the situation. We had become a deadbeat state. Wall Street lowered our rating and then threatened to brand Illinois with junk bond status. It's always tough to raise taxes, but the action we took will shore up our economy and economic standing. So let's consider what we actually passed. The flat personal rate goes from 3% to 5%. So if you're a Democrat, that's a 2% increase. If you're a Republican, it's a 67% increase. And both are true. For corporations, the flat tax rate goes from 4.8% to 7%. There are those who are skeptical of the fact that these tax increases are temporary. but they are temporary. Unless someone votes to keep them, they roll back in 4 years. You know, I was there when Governor Thompson won approval for a temporary tax increase in 1983. Sure enough, 18 months later, it rolled back as planned. In 1990, when Jim Edgar told voters he'd made Governor Thompson's second temporary tax increase permanent, Neil Hartigan said he wouldn't. The voters went with Edgar, and the temporary tax became permanent after a vote. Even the chief operating officer of the group called the Illinois Business Journal said the recent tax increase was inevitable. I quote, "So if you were thinking that the state could balance its budget by cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, you were floating in la-la land." He goes on to say, "I'm not saying that there is nothing that can be cut, but what can actually be cut is chump change compared to the obligations, and the state can't walk away from its pension debts and overdue bills," close quote. We haven't solved all our problems. We are not out of the woods. We are seeing signs of recovery, and I believe Illinois is stabilizing. After our tax increase, 3 Republican governors asked businesses to move to their states, which caused us to look and compare our taxes to theirs. So at this point in time, I would like to just say thank you to Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin. First of all, I want to thank him for making Illinois look normal again. All right? Secondly, after our increase, our taxes are still lower than Wisconsin's. Thank you for pointing that out. Our individual rate is 5%, theirs tops out at 7 3/4. Our corporate rate is 7, while Wisconsin's is almost 8. Then Governor Walker killed a high-speed rail project, and we got the money. And then the company that manufactures the trains is looking to move to Illinois from Wisconsin. So at this time, I would like to introduce, seated at an undisclosed table in this room, the 14 Wisconsin Democratic State Senators. Thank you guys for coming. Welcome to our low-tax state. We hope you continue to stay here, spending money, helping our economy. If you guys stay here for 2 more days, I think you'll be eligible to run for mayor. You know, when Governor Walker got elected, he said he wanted to create 250,000 new jobs. I mistakenly thought he meant in Wisconsin. He's turned out to be a great neighbor. And then there's Governor Christie from New Jersey. New Jersey! He's got the highest tax rates in the nation. He's losing businesses. His state is last in job creation. He skipped his pension payments, which is what got us and our state into trouble. And he withheld $1 billion from local governments. And yet he comes here and expects companies to move from Illinois to New Jersey. I do want to thank him, though, for spending more money in our media markets than he did on his entire pension system. Now, and I don't want to skip Governor Mitch Daniels, the Indiana miracle worker. I must say that even though I've never met him, I have great admiration for him, if only because he got elected governor and he's only 5'7". I admire a guy who's only 5'7" who's in politics. His tax rates aren't that different than ours, and in Indiana they have local income taxes that in many counties put their rates over ours. Navistar didn't hesitate when given the chance to relocate from there to here, a move that invests millions of dollars in Illinois. So businesses, if you want to be taxed in Indiana, you've got to live in Indiana. And the president of China didn't go to Sheboygan or Kokomo or Camden. He touched down here, right here in Chicago, Illinois, which is the best place to live in America. Okay. Last time I was here, I talked to you about the budget, but I didn't have charts, okay? My wife told me I've got to have pie charts, all right? And a happy wife is a happy life, right? So we're gonna have charts here, okay? So first, we're gonna show you where we get our money, all right? Here's where we get our money. We get over half the money from the income tax, but Illinois, keep in mind, is one of only 2 states with an income tax that doesn't tax retirement income. If we tax pensions and other retirement income, we'd collect nearly $1.6 billion more. Keep that in mind. Then we have the sales tax. Keep in mind, Illinois doesn't tax very many services. That means our tax base isn't as broad as other states. You see, we have federal receipts, and those are used to pay for primarily the federal portion of our Medicaid costs and other programs such as the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. Other taxes and fees, including things like the public utility tax, the total is about $34 billion. The next chart shows you how our governor has proposed that we spend the money. So the biggest chunk is education. Preschool, elementary, secondary, and state universities totaling $9.4 billion, over 26% of the spending. Now the next chart is my favorite, because every town meeting I've ever had in 32 years, and every town meeting that every legislator has ever had in Illinois since the lottery's been created, we get the question, I thought the lottery was supposed to fund education. And yes, it does, to the tune of $600 million. As you can see, it's a relatively small slice of the $9.4 billion education budget pie. But $600 million is $600 million. If we didn't have it, we'd have to find it somewhere else. By the way, this chart also represents your chances of winning the Illinois lottery. All right, so back to our expenses. The second biggest component is Medicaid and health care, which includes nursing home funding. The nearly $7.6 billion is over 21% of spending. Third is human services. These are people we contract with who are not state employees, and most are not unionized. It's groups like Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, and the Jewish Federation that provide services for disabled children and keep seniors in their home. You see there's an item there of statutory transfers out, which is 6.4% of state spending. Most of that is money that goes on a per capita basis to our cities and counties. This represents 10% of our income taxes before our increase. Some conservative groups have suggested we should keep that money, just like Governor Christie did in New Jersey. But all that will do is force tax increases at the local level. Now let's look at the operation of state government, and here is where I think, and I hope you might be surprised. Public safety and regulation, which is the state police and the prison system, a whopping 4.5% of spending. Government services, everything else in state government, is only 7.7% of our spending. So overall, we have one of the lowest ratios of state employees to population in the nation. I'm going to repeat that. The lowest ratio of state employees to population in the nation. We have 14,600 fewer state employees than we had 10 years ago. Now you see pensions. Pensions are there at 12.2% of the total, but debt service at 7.1% is primarily covering the borrowing that we've done the last few years for the pension payments. So let's look at pensions. We spend for 5 state pension systems. The General Assembly is a thin slice. The judges is very small. SURS is all of the state university professors, administrators, and myriad other university employees. SERS is all of the state employees. But more than half of our pension spending goes to TRS, the Teachers Retirement System. These are not state employees. They are suburban and downstate local teachers. The amount needed next year for TRS is almost $2.5 billion. So, as you can see, you may have noticed in this presentation that our revenues total $34 billion, and the governor's spending plan totals $36 billion. So there's a $2 billion gap. Now, part of that can be explained by the fact that some of this year's bills won't arrive and won't be paid until next year. That's called lapse spending, and some of it is normal, but not $2 billion worth. So that's a problem. Even after the tax increase, we're going to have to continue to cut, and we have a plan in place to fundamentally reform the way we spend taxpayer dollars in our state. Called budgeting for results, this spending reform means we will no longer make budget decisions based on cost and expense, but on performance and impact and value, the same way you make your spending decisions at home or in your business. We have a number of other reforms that we'd like to pass this year that I'd like to talk about. School reform. I believe the answer to improving education can be found in improving the quality of teachers leading our classroom. We must demand excellence and tailor our hiring and promotion systems to ensure the best and the brightest have these jobs and are rewarded for their excellence while the ineffective are swiftly removed. Pensions. A lot's been written suggesting we should reduce existing employee pension benefits going forward. I believe that is unconstitutional. My stance was reaffirmed recently by the voluminous research conducted by our Chief Legal Counsel, Eric Madere, going back to the very debates that framed our 1970 state constitution. It turns out they envisioned this very situation because the pension systems then weren't any better funded than they are now. The pension protection was explicitly included to protect public pensions for fear the government would renege on its obligations in an economic crisis. I would invite you all to visit our website, which is IllinoisSenateDemocrats.com. Read the research for yourself. That doesn't mean we can't find other constitutional ways to alleviate the burden. So this next chart represents all of the money that the state pays for teacher pensions. This also might surprise you. Please note that only $44 million, 1.8% of the total, goes to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, even though they account for nearly 20% of the teachers of Illinois. Another way to look at this is that 98.2% of the teachers get almost $2.5 billion from the state taxpayers for their teachers' pension fund, and Chicago Teachers Pension Fund gets $44 million. Chicago property taxpayers pay the bulk of the employer's contribution, but the suburbs and downstate school districts pay very little into the system. We must change that. I believe the suburban and downstate districts can and should pay more. After all, it is their locally approved contracts and salary schedules that set the pensions. The state will continue making catch-up payments for those missed in the past, but the district should begin picking up the current normal cost. Another area of reform. We can ask our state retirees to pay more for their health care. The state spends over $500 million for subsidized coverage for retirees. We think they should pay more. Our effort is aimed at former high-level state bureaucrats who took advantage of early retirements and moved on to lucrative second careers while the state picked up the health insurance tab. Another major area of reform is workers' comp. The number one way to improve the business climate in Illinois is to reduce workers' compensation insurance premiums. Despite our many accomplishments, workers' comp remains a stubborn hurdle. The special interests don't want to change because, for them, the existing system is working pretty well. The medical fee schedule in Illinois that determines how much we pay doctors and hospitals is the second highest in the nation. The players in this debate include the doctors, the hospitals, the unions, the workers' comp lawyers, and so far we have not been able to get people to compromise. This must change, and the governor's initiated meetings to find a legislative solution. So we're on the path to economic stability, but one of the things we've got to do is pay the people who do business with Illinois. I made a reference to lapsed spending a bit ago, paying one year's bills in the next year. In your own home, it would be like buying Christmas presents on a credit card, and the bill doesn't arrive until sometime in January. In our case, though, we've rung up some huge bills, around $8.5 billion. What we'd like to do is cut up the credit card and not get into this sort of debt again. No more borrowing for our pension obligations, but we still have this old tab to pay. Our plan is akin to using a low interest rate on a home equity line of credit to pay off an overwhelming balance on a high interest rate credit card. The ugly truth is that we've balanced our budget for years by using money owed to state vendors and telling them we'll pay them later and later and later. So if you look, this chart shows we owe $1 billion for corporate tax refunds that are owed, and $1.5 billion to pay our state group health insurance bills. The backlog includes $6 billion for services people have provided on our behalf and money we owe other government entities. We're talking about school districts, hospitals, the RTA, and universities, and it's taking an economic toll. Last year, the Lutheran Social Services, one of the state's largest social service providers, nearly closed its doors because it exhausted its credit line, borrowing to cover the money we owe them. I also object to those who call our plan increased borrowing. We've already borrowed the money. It's just a question of who we're going to pay and when. A portion of the tax increase we passed is earmarked for the next 14 years, specifically to pay off the debt service on what we would need to pay off this $8.5 billion. But we need Republican votes to move forward. There's no denying we owe a lot of people a lot of money, and it's high time we paid them. If we don't, we end up paying more for state services as businesses choose to stop doing business with us, or they raise their bids because they can't rely on timely payments. These are not responsible business practices, and it's no way to run a government. So I believe that we've accomplished much in 2 years. It's been very painful to raise revenues from our citizens, but without it, we would have had a disastrous fiscal crisis. We have much more to accomplish this year, but with bipartisanship, I believe we will be on a path to stability. I thank you again for the opportunity to address you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. We got time for questions?
We have a few questions here. Don't worry, no media.
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah.
Just between the. Hi, Tara. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Tara.
For those of you who've never been to Springfield, that's how it works. Okay. Not bad. Okay, Anthony Cole on our board from the Haymarket Center. What factors will determine funding priorities for the Department of Human Services?
Well, we've had some real troubles this fiscal year, which ends at the end of June. The way we appropriated the money for this fiscal year was we said to the governor, this is all the money we have, you figure out how to spend it. But next year, our plan is to do line item budgets, where we determine, the legislature determines how much can be spent. And so we're going to go through this budgeting for outcomes. We're going to go through every program, make sure it works. If it works, we're going to try to find the money for it. So it's going to be through the appropriation process. Senator Staines, Senator Katowski are our chairman of our Appropriations Committee. The House is doing the same thing. We're going to work on being more efficient in providing these basic services. But social service folks are the people that have not been getting money over the past 10 years. They're adjusted for inflation. They're the ones that have taken the biggest hit. And it's vital services. People don't even realize that the state's providing the money for them because it's not state employees. But it's vital. It's something we have to come up with the money for. And in part, that's why we had to raise our income.
Next questions from my old colleague Addison Woodward and Richard Johnson, two illustrious retired professors. It is clear that the temporary 2% income tax is inadequate. Isn't it time for the Senate to adopt a progressive tax that would be fair and generate more revenue over time?
Okay, that points out the fact that our Constitution says the income tax has to be flat. So a progressive tax would involve a constitutional amendment, which couldn't be voted on for 2 more years. And it's been discussed in Springfield, and it hasn't had the sufficient votes to pass. So in the meantime, we had to act, and that's why we had to do what we did. So ideally, progressive income tax is possible. There's other ways to make our tax more progressive. You can increase the earned income tax credit, you can increase the personal exemptions, and you can give other tax credits to folks. So that's an option that would be possible. If the Republicans want to talk about tax reform, which would be revenue neutral, I'm all in. In other words, if we want to talk about perhaps taxing some of that retirement income, maybe tax retirement income up to age 65. If we want to expand the tax base and the sales taxes, we can do that and then lower overall rates. I'm all in favor of that. That's what would be tax reform. But as far as progressivity, short of a constitutional amendment, we have to do it in the way I described.
Okay. Next question from our old pal Reuben Hedlund. Would you be in favor of a study of the economic benefits, costs, and revenues of a high-speed rail corridor between Chicago and O'Hare? And also Mitchell Field in Milwaukee, and of course, he left it out, but we all know St. Louis, because I could tell 90% of people are just dying to get to St. Louis.
Well, we did pass this capital bill. Part of the capital bill was a great deal of money for high-speed rail. Senator Durbin asked that we put it in there. I think it was something like $400 million. It was done at a time that we could attract federal dollars. If we can encourage some more of those Republican governors to continue to give up their high-speed rail dollars so we can take them, and then we can use it to get high-speed rail out to O'Hare. It sounds like a great idea.
This one is from M. Davis. Where are you, M? Okay, I see. There you are. Don't normally like initials. All right. Have any bills been introduced which address the point you made about hiring and retaining good teachers and removing those who fail to meet those standards?
Yes, we have a great state senator in Kimberly Lightford who's negotiated things like charter schools, expansion of charter schools, and race to the top legislation. She's working with unions, a number of interest groups with regard to issues on tenure, on getting rid of bad teachers, and we expect that I can guarantee you there's great progress being made so far, and we will have some major school reform legislation this year.
Another high-speed rail question, normally twice our limit. Senator, you properly criticize Wisconsin for bailing out of the high-speed rail, but this is from Graham Grady, but doesn't the loss of the Milwaukee, Madison, Minneapolis, St. Paul route significantly derail the Chicago high-speed rail hub and spoke plan?
Now, how do you expect me to know anything about that, Graham?
There you go. Good answer. Bottom line, take the money and figure it out later. Okay. This one is can't figure it out, the name, but it's a good question. What is it that our senators and reps wait? Why is it that our senators and reps wait until the patient is about almost dead and in oxygen to begin to help? Pension reform. This is a very convoluted question, and I'm afraid I can't answer it. All right, the last question. This is a great one, and we always leave with a softball. This is from John Legg. John, where are you? Raise your hand. Remember, you want a question asked, you got to sign your name and put it on the official form. You'll like this one. Describe the Democrat and Republican relationship in the Senate and compare it to Wisconsin and Indiana.
Well, we get along. The Speaker and I and the Governor, we try to work. And we also have a very good relationship, I would point out, with our Republican colleagues. Senator Radonio and I have a very good relationship. We both got elected the same day. We worked together on the impeachment trial. We worked together on all of these accomplishments that we talked about earlier that you may not have read about in the paper up here in Chicago. We did that together. Taxes are very difficult. The things like McCormick Place and those things are tough because you're going to, asking some of your traditional allies to give stuff back. In a different era, the big problem every year was to decide how to spend the new money that came in. That hasn't been the case the last 2 years. So we are cognizant of the fact that people don't want politics done, that they want cooperation, and we've had it. And I'm going to continue to do so this next couple years. Thank you.